like to welcome all of you to this webinar on needs assessment versus needs analysis. I've known Brett since before I joined Opal in 2007. Since then, he's been an Opal student, a graduate, a member of our faculty. I've invited him today to share his work with us on needs assessment and needs analysis. Brett, it's all yours.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is stop my video because what you're going to see on the slides is probably more important than looking at me, and that will save some bandwidth. So first, thanks, Steve, for inviting me. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk about my little process model. One of the things that I've learned in the field of performance improvement is that we never stop learning. During the past 13 years or so of practicing the craft, I've continued to discover new models, or new to me because you can't read everything, and watched old models get updated. Additionally, I've listened to or read numerous debates about those models, especially at the ISPI conferences. And as someone who's also fortunate to teach in the field, I'm always working to try and boil things down into simpler terms for my older and simple mind. That way I don't confuse my students or my clients, because my regular daytime job is consulting. And so that helps when I try to explain things. And so that's how I arrived at my very own model. And it's not mine, of course. It's built on the work of the thought leaders in our field, and it continues to be improved by friends and colleagues each time a new iteration is shared. This started out as a simple diagram to explain the difference between needs assessment and needs analysis, and training needs analysis for one of my clients. And then it's grown into what we'll look at in a few minutes. Before we do that, I'd like to take a quick look at ISPI's 10 standards, because I know some of the people that are joining from the 536 classes may not have seen those yet. So this is the principles, and they're often referred to as RSVP. So I'll let you have a little quick read of those. You'll see at the bottom there's a plus, which is to remain solution neutral. And that plus was added to the 10 standards unofficially by a practitioner by the name of Dr. Roger Addison. And his point is that we have to always remain solution neutral when we're first looking at the problem or opportunity that's being presented to us. It's not actually in the official 10 standards, but it's often referred to as RSVP plus, and that's a really, really good addition, and something to keep in mind when you're doing your performance improvement work. So then the next set of the standards 5 to 10 are the systematic process that we use to improve performance. I split them up into 2 slides so they're easier to read. So these are the first 3: needs analysis, cause analysis, and design. And then the remaining 4 are, sorry, the remaining 3, I can't count, are developing the solutions, implementing them, and then measuring the results. So those are the 10 standards. And the reason I wanted to show them to you is I'll show you how the process model that we're going to talk about aligns with these 10 standards. So this is the model that was published in 2018 and that Steve had asked me to talk about. And this iteration of it came from some feedback from Dr. Peter Honebein, who's also a professor at Boise and is teaching one of the 536 classes right now. And one of his past students, who noted that there was no mention of business requirements anywhere in the process models. And Pete's all about the business processes. The student liked the model, said it was easy to read and follow, and it was the first ADDIE type model that he'd seen, and that he could understand exactly how he could use it right away. So that was really good feedback for me, made me think I'm onto something. But it was missing these business requirements. And you know, I thought, how did I miss that? If it takes a village to raise a child, how many HPT practitioners does it take to create a useful model? So that sent me back to the drawing board. And since this article, where we added the business requirements, which are shown on here as organizational requirements, there's been 6 more iterations, resulting in a version 10, which is right here. And that's the model that we're going to talk about today. So let's get right down to it. So here's a little bit fuller view of it. It's a little more complicated than the version 4, but it's really not too bad when you walk through it. So we're going to work through this together, and I'm going to share a couple stories along the way about some of the different points in the model, and then we'll have some time for questions afterwards. So the first big change was these 3 foundational activities: change management, project management, and formative evaluation are 3 activities that should be occurring all throughout the performance improvement process. Project management is a lot more involved at the start, and then once the interventions are selected, change management really starts to kick into gear. And formative evaluation occurs throughout. So we should be deliberately circling back to engage the stakeholders in every step to make sure that we're on the right track, and at each step revisit organizational goals and confirm that what we are doing is going to close the gap. So we have a question here from Jessica, and she asks, what have been the biggest reiterations of ISPI's standards since OPAL start to OPAL 2021? That's a great question. So I know the standards went through 1 rewrite for sure. Steve, if you have any exact detail on the history of this, feel free to jump in. I know they went through 1 rewrite, and it was, I want to say, mid to late 2010 area. But since then, they've remained the same. They haven't changed for over a decade.
Yes, and OPAL precedes the ISPI standards. OPAL's been around since 1987, before ISPI formulated the standards. Did we answer your question, Jessica?
Yes, perfect. Okay, so we'll go on to the next slide. Please advance. There we go. So step 1, and this is the big part of the topic tonight, but we'll work through the whole process. So needs assessment versus needs analysis. This is how it all started. The 536 classes, some of those folks are here tonight, are learning from Rothwell, Hone, and King that it's not always about problems. Sometimes we can take good performance and make it even better. And that's why the start box at the top left is performance problem or opportunity. So I'll show these little bubbles everywhere in each step as we go along. Standards 1 to 4 apply all throughout the performance improvement process model. This particular step is about standard 5, which is the needs assessment. So we do an assessment first to make sure that addressing the problem or opportunity will add value by fulfilling an organizational need. So this was part of that change, was we added the organizational requirements. up here in the diamond at the top. Assessing a need before analyzing it reduces or eliminates the potential risk of assuming that what is being analyzed is the root cause of the performance deficiency. So that's why we do an assessment first. And so this is the HPT model from ISPI. It was created by Van Teen, Mosley, and Desinger. This version came out in 2012, but it's been around longer than that. And this is where I started to really think about this model because, or my model, because this whole box in blue is called the performance analysis of need or opportunity. And nowhere in there is an assessment. So a less experienced practitioner might dive right in and start doing an organizational and environmental analysis when first presented the problem, when the problem hasn't been assessed and we don't know if that's something that's actually worth pursuing. So it's a great model, but it doesn't include the needs assessment piece. So if you don't know that part of it, which really came from Roger Kaufman, then you might go down a road that you shouldn't and end up using up a lot of resources that you didn't need to. Okay, so these yellow squares show the changes from the previous version. So you'll see on the left, it says world, workplace, work, and worker. It used to say mega, macro, and micro, which comes from Kaufman's organizational elements model. The world, workplace, work, and worker come from Addison, Haig, and Kearney's book, Performance Architecture, which I think is a better way to describe it for people that are outside of the field and might not be familiar with Kaufman's model. And as I said earlier, we added the based on current organizational requirements up here under the want or need. And the reason we have a want and a stop is sometimes people come to you with a problem and they already have a solution in mind, and it's a solution that you know from your own experience that won't work. So when that's a want and they don't want to work to find out what the need is, you need to stop them and come and convince them that a needs assessment is required to get to that true problem. Okay, so a little story about that. In a project I was doing, I think about 3 or 4 years ago now, I billed the Canadian government over $15,000 to build a course to fix a performance problem. And why did we choose a course? We didn't. My client told me that their senior manager had directed them to build a course to fix this perceived problem. And so this is an example of they've come to me and said, here's the problem, here's the solution, just do it. And so the client almost always comes to you solution oriented. And this is a key message for this part of the model, is that plus in the RSVP plus and remaining solution neutral. And that's critical. So the folks involved in this situation, there was 2 different groups that worked together to design exercises for the military, great big complicated exercises, and they're distributed exercises. So there's people from different locations in the world all dialing into a networked environment, and they they practice war fighting in this virtual environment. So there's the technical folks, and then there's the exercise planners, the war fighters, and they need to work together to design, develop, and execute these big exercises. The problem was that there was not a lot of coordination between these two groups in the early stages of the exercise planning. And as a result, the quality of the events and the cost of the events, the quality was lower and the cost was higher because of these, the inability to work together a year out when they're first starting to plan these exercises. So after doing some research, it occurred to me that, well, first, the tech folks aren't being asked to the design sessions until it's too late. And if they collaborated more at the start and had a synchronized plan from both groups, that would result in lower costs and hopefully a better quality exercise. So I went back to the two groups, and after looking at the processes that both groups had published for their side of the design process for these exercises, and said, you know, if you guys work together and wrote one process, we probably wouldn't have to build this training. And rather than training one group of people this year and then another group next year and another group the year after and so on and so on, you would have instead a better set of processes that would guide you guys and then the people that come in and follow you in these jobs later on. And they said, yes, you're probably right, but we were told to build a course. So I built the course, we delivered it, it was excellent, everybody loved it, and they all understood, and the course was never delivered again, and they continue to experience the same problems. So a little frustrating, but that's the way it goes sometimes. And when Steve talked to me about doing this presentation, he asked if I could talk about what techniques I use to get a client to consider a needs assessment, needs analysis, and during those needs assessments to inform clients when their understandings of the problem or the perceived solution are off target. So I had to sit and do a little bit of reflection on that. In the example I just explained, I did try to do that and I failed because I wasn't able to talk to the right person, which was the senior manager. Excuse me. So some of the things that I use when I talk to folks about this is it's a lot of questioning. So, you know, I ask about which organizational goals will be achieved if we do what the client is coming to me and asking me to do. You know, what goal will be achieved? What will the result be if we do this? How are things going to change if we implement your solution? And quite often that leads to a deeper discussion because it often uncovers that what they're talking about is a symptom rather than the true problem. And we're going to talk more about that in a couple minutes. I also talk about which other functions within the organization will be impacted. And Roger Kaufman used to challenge me and say, we never have time to analyze a problem before tackling it, but we always have time to go back and try and fix it again later. So I try and present that to the clients as well and say, you know, it's worth taking a little time up front here to look at this in depth and make sure that what we're doing is going to fix your problem. And Steve just mentioned in the chat that after meeting our due diligence to conduct a needs assessment, we can find that clients won't support it, and it does unfortunately happen. And so you have a choice. I mean, ethically, I could have said, I'm not going to build the course because it's not going to fix your problem. However, they do come to me for a lot of work, and so I need to feed my family, and I warned them. So we carried on and we built the beautiful training package. So those are some of the techniques I use. And Steve, do you have any others you want to add to that before we go on?
Um, Yeah, first of all, I've had that experience too, where you do your best to try to get permission to do right by your client, and it's not forthcoming. And then you just, got to figure out how to deal with it and or move on. When I'm in those situations, the technique I've had a lot of success with comes from Tim Gillum and Kerry Mortensen. And it's the idea of saying, uh, if I gave you a magic wand, what would you see people doing on the job that you're not seeing them doing now?
Mm.
And what's nice about that question is oftentimes they want to talk about things that matter to them that aren't helpful. People need to know something. People need to understand something. People need to appreciate something. People need to um, comprehend something. And that's not really helpful because nobody gets paid to do that on the job. And so I try to get or wrangle the conversation so we're talking about the workforce performance that's important to them.
Hmm.
And the magic wand trick seems to help them get there and help them move from language and thoughts that aren't that helpful to really getting at what is it that they need to be doing that they're not.
Yeah, that's a good one. I hadn't thought of that. I call it the king for a day. If
Oh,
you were king
yeah.
for a day, what would the organization look like? That's a great one. I will have to go back and add that into this slide. Okay, so uh, the next step in the process, and we're going to go through these a little quicker so we have some time to do questions and answers at the end. So the second step is cause analysis and intervention selection. This is standards 1 to 4 again, and standard 6, determining the cause. So here we're doing the root cause analysis, and uh, once we've identified the root causes, we want to go back and make sure that our organizational requirements are still working. Quite often, once you've figured out what the root cause of the problem is, there will be a need to rewrite some organizational requirements, which becomes an intervention all on its own. And so sometimes we need to restate goals and make them SMART. And I think everybody should know what SMART goals are now. I know my class just went through that last week. Dr. Honebine, Peter Honebine, wrote an article in the Performance Improvement Journal called Specifying Human Performance Solutions Through Well-Formed Business Requirements. And that was in the same issue as my article on this model, and they kind of went together really nicely. So if you're not sure how to write business requirements, that is a perfect 3-page job aid. And we can make that available to you afterwards if you're interested in that. So then once we've done that, we do an intervention analysis, and that's where we decide if training is part of the answer. If training and non-training interventions are used, then they should be integrated. It's not binary. These things should be designed, developed, and implemented together. So at the bottom in the yellow, this is the new things that were added to version 10. So when we're selecting the interventions, if it's a big and costly intervention, it's good to do a cost benefit analysis and determine with the stakeholders whether it's best to buy, build, or modify whatever it is that you're bringing in to help close the performance gap. And then after you do that, you should write a business case to fully lay out all the costs for designing, developing, and implementing and sustaining it over the long term. And then once that's all done, you present it to the sponsor for approval. Otherwise, you could get into starting to do that design and development work, and the sponsor finds out and doesn't agree with what you're doing and puts a stop to it. So it's better to get that up front, make sure that everybody's on board with the direction that you're headed. If they're not, you stop, and then you may go back and look at different interventions that are more palatable to the client. Maybe something that's a little cheaper or quicker to implement, you know, it depends on the situation. So those were the changes to that one. Then we go into step 3. Oh, but first I'm going to tell you a quick little story. This is not mine. This is a colleague of mine that worked for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or the RCMP. He was a consultant and was brought in by the RCMP to look at a dispatch center that was run by a police officer but manned by civilians. So we have, the first thing we have there is 2 different people with 2 different types of backgrounds. Shortly after the, or I guess about a year after the call center had been in operation, performance started to drop very quickly. And so my colleague was brought in and asked for a course on multitasking. So once again, the client is coming with the solution already in mind, saying it's a complicated job. They've got several monitors and multiple keyboards, internal communications. So they need to learn how to multitask. And as a side note, scientifically proven multitasking is not a thing. It's task switching. But that's for another day. So the symptoms that were presented to the consultant were rising absenteeism and increasing overtime costs. And so the consultant asked to go and see the call center in action. They interviewed the operators, they did some direct observation, and came to the conclusion that it wasn't about the ability to multitask, it was actually the physical work environment. When the call center was designed and stood up, they were given standard office chairs. And these chairs would have been great for an 8 to 4 job, but this is a 24/7 place, so the chairs are used and abused and were breaking down. And in fact, he described one of the chairs as being, it was missing one of the wheels, so they had put a Yellow Pages telephone book under the leg of the chair where the wheel had fallen off to hold the chair up. So it was that bad. So that was leading to back issues, and, you know, ergonomics was a factor. And they also found that the motivation was down, and determined that the cleaning staff contract that had been implemented needed to be changed, because the cleaners came in from 8 to 4 Monday to Friday, but as I said earlier, operations were 24/7. So imagine the mess that they were experiencing for the shift coming in on Monday morning. So they recommended that the chairs get fixed. They changed the cleaning schedule so that it was supported the 24/7 operations, and performance improved. So just another example of you know, understanding what the true cause of the problem is really important. So step 3 is design and develop interventions. Once we know what's actually causing the pain, we need to design and develop interventions that bring about the desired improvements. So this covers standards 7 and 8 in the 10 standards from ISPI. Design solutions, and when we do that, we include the plan for implementation and evaluation. And then the standard 8 is ensuring that the solution has conformity and feasibility for the organization. So these are the changes from the previous version. We included defining user requirements for non-training interventions, and making sure that the performance objectives that are going to take us to those desired organizational goals are correct, and then identifying the proper metrics to measure that, because shortly we're going to talk about measurement. So then we develop the interventions, and it's on to step 4, which is implementation. And this is where the rubber hits the road, right? Like Nike says, just do it. So if you've done everything right, there should be the fun part. A common saying in the military is your plan will only survive until first contact with the enemy, meaning no matter how well you plan, there's always going to be something that wasn't thought of and you will need to deal with it. So be prepared. So hopefully we'll think of everything, but there's always something, and you adjust as you go, which is part of that whole formative evaluation that we do throughout. So implementation is standard 9, implement solutions. And this was all added to the model, which seems kind of silly that my earlier iterations did not have implementation, but there you go. It didn't, so now it does. And Steve said in the chat that he suspects that detailed planning enables real-time improvisation during implementation. Absolutely. And so even when you haven't thought of every eventuality, by planning for different eventualities, it helps you be more agile as you're going through the process. And then, so finally, step 5 is measurement. And performance isn't improved until we can measure and show the impact of the change. The worst case scenario is nothing changed or it got worse, and we're going to have to go back to the start of the model and start all over again. The worst case is that the client doesn't even want you to or have the resources to measure. And sadly, this is more common than it should be. Quite often, once you've implemented it, the client's happy and ready to move on and doesn't want to consider measurement. So as professionals in this field, back at the beginning, we want to talk about measurement and make sure that as we work through this and we get to that design and development stage, that we're identifying metrics that we can use to show our clients that performance has actually improved. And so that's standard number 10. This is how we demonstrate value to our clients, and it is very, very important. The only change to the model here was that little infinity symbol at the bottom, because we want to keep measuring. And that's the whole model. One quick story about this. Yeah, I got time. So I was working in a, it was called the Distributed Learning Company. So it was a military organization. Our job was to take classroom face-to-face training and convert it to online training. And when I got there, the projects, these were big e-learning projects, like 40 hours of classroom learning being converted to e-learning. So big projects. And they wanted the projects to be finished at half the price in a shorter time frame using internal resources. So to be able to do that, you have to measure and show the results. If you don't, it's guaranteed that somebody will be wondering if it was worth all the time and effort to do all the things that you did. So you need to be able to do the math and show your clients the end result. If it was a bad result, be transparent and learn from it, because you are a professional. I have no doubt that your results are going to be awesome. So in this case, we were doing these projects. It took a year to execute them. And sorry, I've lost my way. It took a year to execute them. We didn't know how much it cost, and the level of quality had never really been assessed. So what we wanted to do was change that, because there was threats of this unit being shut down and all this work being sent out to contractors to do externally. And I believed that it could be done cheaper, faster, and just as good or better than the civilian contractors. So we did a whole bunch of interventions. We started applying project management. We strengthened the ISD approach that was being used to do it. We changed how the developers were doing their work internally. And we changed how we worked with the subject matter experts. And after we did all that, we were bringing the same size of projects down to 6 months in time. And we did a costing, and the cost part is a little different because it was a military organization. So normally employee salaries don't get figured into things, but we did the tough homework to figure out what all those costs would be, including facility costs and the computers and the software and everything. And then we went out to industry and said, how much would you charge us to do a project of this scope? And we got quotes from 3 different big military contractors, and it was 2 to 5 times higher than what it had cost us to do it. So we were able to show a cost savings. We were able to show that we could do it fast within 6 months, so half the time. And we then submitted one of the projects to the Canadian Society for Training Development to have it judged in their annual e-learning competition, and it received a gold award. So it was reaching the highest standards in the civilian world. So we were able to show time, cost, and quality were all improved using these new processes. And it was a success. So we were happy with that. And over the short term, the organization was allowed to continue running. Unfortunately, a couple of years after I left, it was shut down anyway. And thankfully, now that I'm a consultant, they put out a lot of that work to industry. So it's in the long run, it's helped me a lot. And it keeps me busy doing my daytime job. So the point of the story is you need to come up with those measures, and you need to measure continually so that you can identify where things have improved or not, and then keep measuring over time so that we can identify trends. And that is the model. So we'll open it up to questions now. And Steve, I think people can use their microphones if they'd like. We've got about 10 minutes left.
Indeed.
So if you have any questions, feel free to unmute your mic, and we'll talk about whatever you want to talk about. Going once? Going twice?
I have a comment. One thing that strikes me is we can kind of link the end of your model back to the beginning, in that one of the things that's really important about the needs assessment versus the needs analysis is that the needs assessment, is a deep dive into the problem or the opportunity with the idea of, kind of specifying what's really going on there. But the other value is that if you do a good needs assessment, you're going to come out with a statement of a performance gap that's going to already have some pretty good standards and measures associated with it. And what's really important is that you need to have that up front, and it ought to come out of your needs assessment so that later on, everyone knows what a success story looks like when you're towards the end of any project that follows the needs assessment, and you're trying to determine whether or not you close the gap. It's come up with the measures after the project's already over, rather than if you build it into the project early during the needs assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of that is why that arrow comes back out of the results not improved and back to the beginning.
Mhm.
Um, so that if those measures you came up with up here um, didn't work, then you can circle back and work on it again. One thing I forgot to mention, and I'm not sure why, is this prioritize the gaps box under
Yes.
needs assessment um, is important also, because generally when you do the needs assessment, you identify a lot more problems and opportunities than the organization is willing or able to take on at that time. So um, you have a discussion with them after the gaps have been identified to prioritize what they want to deal with first, and then you do your deep dive in the needs slash performance analysis. Okay,
And
so we've got a question in the chat from Robert. How do you engage your model with clients? That is the model something you keep in your mind or to one side while you work with the client? In other words, how aware is your client that they are going through your model as you work together? That's a good question. And I actually asked that question of, uh, oh, I'm forgetting his name, of Gary Rumler, who taught me during an ISPI conference in a 3-day workshop. And I asked him the same question. And he said, he told me he never shows them the models because it tends to overwhelm them. So it's better if you have the model in your head and you can kind of talk through the process with them. Um, if you throw this up on a slide with a client, generally they get pretty scared and think, oh my God, we're never going to be able to do all this. And quite often you can go into an organization and look at what's going on there and run through this whole thing in your head while you're talking with the client and come up with potential solutions to recommend to them in a 1 hour visit. And I did this talking to a small business owner. She had a health and wellness uh, business, like a beauty salon with some other stuff, massage therapy and aromatherapy and that sort of thing. And um, as she talked through her problems, it became obvious that one of the things she needed to do was write down the standard operating procedures for her staff so that they would all perform the same way for the clients. So that was one easy fix. Um, and the other one was setting goals for her employees. Her employees didn't get regular feedback. They didn't have specific goals for sales that they needed to meet. And so there was 3 things after just a 1 hour discussion that she was able to implement and improved her business immensely. Okay, so another question, if there's time, how would you distinguish formative assessment with agile methodologies since they are both iterative? Well, that's a good question. So uh, I don't I don't use agile. I use project management because I tend to work on much bigger projects that take longer. And agile doesn't seem as well suited as project management for that. Or maybe it's just because I'm more comfortable with that approach. So the project management is meant to go more with the formative evaluation, and agile would be more on its own, if that makes sense. And then we have a question from Jessica. Is there any way to condense this while you are speaking with a client or some sort of process you've used to memorize each step? Like we use the term ADDIE. Yep, this is absolutely based on the ADDIE model and the 10 step or the 10 standards from ISPI. which is RSVP and then ADDIE, analyze, design, develop, implement, and evaluate. So that's generally how I do it. And I just over time have worked in the more particular nuances about wants or needs. That came from Roger Kaufman, and the 4 Ws, world, workplace, work, and worker. That comes from Addison, Hagen, Kearney. The organizational requirements themselves and writing them comes from Peter Honevine. Root cause analysis, we all know, comes from our founding father, Dr. Tom Gilbert. And Gary Rumler also has a good model that I use for that most of the time. So now I've been doing this for 13 years and I apply it all the time. So I don't generally need to look at the model as much anymore when I do it. But sometimes, I pull it out, sit down and think, okay, where am I at in this process right now? And what do I need to do next? It's, it's a nice roadmap to have to guide me along. Does that help?
And I think the other thing I heard you say, Brett, is that when you're working with a client, you're not going to have a meeting that, is going to be about going through the whole model in great detail.
No.
That will only scare and annoy them. But conversely, when you're sitting down with them, and if you're working, for example, on an aspect of the needs assessment, you have that part of the model in your head and you're trying to think, am I dealing with a problem or an opportunity? Is this a want or a need kind of thing? At what level of performance am I dealing with? And so at that point, you're kind of concerned more about the needs assessment, and you're not actually trying to think through what you might be doing in terms of creating the training or doing an evaluation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's one step at a time. And for sure, when you're sitting down with a client at the front end, you're doing the needs assessment part, and you are thinking in your mind about all these different things. And you may, while you're sitting there talking with them, have Rumler's 9 boxes model and Gilbert's BEM on a piece of paper beside you to help tweak you to think about those different things. It's Rumler's model that talks about the organizational level, process level, and worker level, and Addison's work for world, workplace, work, and worker is an extension on that. And the world part actually comes from Kaufman and talking about mega results outside of the organization. Addison just took that and changed it and called it world. So, lots of different people have taken this process and, modified it to suit their model or their need or their book that they're writing, which makes it more difficult for people studying this field to understand what's going on. And the 536 class last week, we're looking at 5 or 6 different definitions of HPT, and their job was to pull out the commonalities in all those definitions. And this week they're looking at, what's systemic versus systematic. They all have it, but they all put it in a little different way. So as you get more time in the field and you spend more time looking at the models, you will understand where the different nuances come from and who took what from where and, borrowed from somebody else to put it all together. But generally it's ADDIE. So if you remember ADDIE and then some of the more particular things about each phase, then that will get you off on the right foot anyway.
The other thing that strikes me, Brett, is the extent to which our OPAL practices differ. So, you were initially a training development officer in the Canadian Armed Forces, right?
Mhm.
And then, you were introduced to performance improvement, and your current consulting practice, draws on the integration of those two things.
Mhm.
And I can see the influence of the Canadian Forces ID model, CFITES,
Mhm.
right?
Yep.
In this, especially in terms of the additional detail that are in here in terms of instruction. So the ID metrics, the performance objectives, training needs analysis, and so on.
Mhm.
Uh, my consulting practice was a little bit different in that we did a lot of large scale performance support systems. And so, in addition to doing training things with those, we also spent a lot of time looking at standards and feedback systems. We spent a lot of time looking at process engineering and building custom software tools.
Mhm.
And so a model that would come out of Steve's head might detail more about the non-training interventions. We also know, colleagues of ours that spend more work with incentive systems and consequences. And, they might include, more aspects about that as well. I always maintain that my safest bet as a consultant walking into a new organization is that the consequence system is broken and that the organization has found clever ways to reward the behaviors they don't want and punish the behaviors they do. Is that a safe bet in your practice?
Uh, okay, well, I've already admitted that my main client is the military, and we're going to publish this. So I don't know if I want to say that.
Okay,
Um,
never
no,
mind.
no. Honestly, my main client is the military, and yes, that is always a problem. As is the codification or writing down how they do what they do. Um, a client I'm working with right now, they are really struggling with that. And you know, their system that they're trying to implement, there are no consequences um, for not performing. The consequence is, okay, well, we'll push it into next year's schedule and we'll do it next year.
Ouch.
Yeah, yeah, it's uh, it's a tough one, and this is a huge organization, so um, we're working on it. We'll see where we go with it. But you know, using the models that we use in our field, I have been able to show them some of these things, and they do understand it. Um, Part of the challenge for them is, you know, even though this is the uh, training system for one of four major components of the military, I hope I'm keeping it big enough. um, they still are reliant on other pieces of that huge organization, you know, like the people that build the facilities and the people that manage the multi-million-dollar contracts, and they still rely on them to do what they have to do um, to permit them to move forward in their mission. So it's a wicked problem. And we're now 4 or 5 minutes into everybody else's time, so I don't want to steal any of your time, folks. I know you've got lots of studies to do, so if there's any other questions, I'm happy to stick around. We can talk as long as you want, or we can call this finished. Up to you guys.
Are there other questions or comments for Brett?
Okay, so just before we go, I'm going to flash up this is a link to my blog, and you can find the latest version of this model on there with a little article about where it came from and everything. And there's other stuff there, lots of stuff about performance improvement and training. When I get the bug, I sit down and write. And thank you for all the thanks. It was fun to do.
Brett, we appreciate your spending time with us and sharing your expertise. This concludes this Opal webinar. Thank you all, and we'll be posting this in our classes here shortly.
Thanks,
Good
Steve.
night.
Good night, everybody.